and succeed.
Until now, we studied the origins of Western thought as being Greece and Rome, but then we were misunderstanding something about how political thinkers at the dawn of modernity were thinking. There was something else there, some other part of the story that we haven't taken into account until now. So until we take that into account, we're not properly understanding the origins of the modern West, the origins of modern politics, how these thinkers who we base our societies on today, how were they thinking? And if we don't understand that part of the modern world is built on, in fact, our ideas and Jewish sources, then we're always going to have this divide between what it means to be a Jewish state and what it means to be a modern state or a Western state. We'll always have this divide between Judaism and modernity. Early modernity is a time where there were a lot of changes in the modern world, in the world that was becoming modern. And one of the changes was that it was moving into, the world was moving into a world of nation states. And there's a very significant moment where there were no other models, as far as the early moderns understood themselves, for their political societies other than the Hebrew model. The Hebrews had a model of a nation state. They had a model of a nation with its own laws and institutions that governed itself, which was what everyone was looking for at this period. They didn't want more change. It's a book by an Englishman named John Selden. John Selden was the most important legal thinker of 17th century England. That's pretty much undisputed by everybody who mentions him. For example, Thomas Hobbes, who's the most important early political philosopher. He's probably, some people would say he's the first political philosopher of the modern world. Others would date it back to Machiavelli, but either Hobbes or Machiavelli were the first political philosophers of the modern world. This is John Selden's major work. The book is called On the Laws of Nature and of the Nations, According to the Teachings of the Hebrews, in 7 books. The book's in Latin. I just simultaneously translated De Jure Naturale et Gentium Juxta Disciplinam Hebraeorum, which is Libri Septem in 7 books. If you turn to any page, and I can show you this, the book looks like the Talmud. It has 2 columns. It has, inside the Latin, almost on any page we turn to, and this was very random, it has Hebrew writing inside the Latin. And if we look on the footnotes of any page, we find all sorts of rabbinical sources. So in this case, we find Gemara Babylonian under the title Shabbat. We find Sefer Kuzari, which is Rabbi Yehuda Levi's great work. We find Yehuda ben Sol in commentary. There are about over 100 rabbinic sources or rabbis cited in this work. John Selden, writing this book, is writing at a time when there are no Jews in England. So he's writing this book full of Hebrew sources and there are no Jews in England. So what are the Jewish sources doing here? How did he come across them? And I was on a mission. Well, something that we were always taught about modernity, of course, is that modernity is a secular enterprise. So if modernity is a secular enterprise, when we read modern books, for example, Hobbes' Leviathan, which is the first work of Western political thought as I was taught it. And Hobbes is an atheist, and everything's just like that. You know, this is the way things are. So then if you see Hebrew writing in political sources, then what's the Hebrew writing doing there? You know, it's been explained away as being part of messianism of these societies, the use of Hebrew sources, but it's not just that. And in fact, these works are something else. And this is something that we were coming to discover, both the story that had been told until now and the story that we can tell today a bit better. Although Jews had been expelled hundreds of years before from England when Selden and other writers of his period are writing, they knew Hebrew. There was Hebrew being taught at Oxford and at Cambridge. There were chairs of Hebrew, also at all the major universities around Europe. There were conversos in various places teaching Hebrew to non-Jews. It was one of the 3 languages that you were allowed to speak at the major universities, say Oxford and Cambridge. You were allowed to speak Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. The people who made their way from England to America in the mid-17th century and a little earlier than that were coming from this world where Hebrew, Greek, and Latin were the 3 languages of the humanist world. In fact, the opening address at Yale University, was delivered in Hebrew. And you know, Hebrew had this extra added value of being a common language both between the sort of Puritans and the more messianic political thinkers and authors and speakers and the academic world. We are in a process now of recovery, of understanding the relative place of Jewish sources alongside sources of Greece and Rome in the political tradition. There were about 100 works in this period between 1574 and, say, 1680, which were called some variation on the Hebrew Republic, where the ancient Hebrews, taken in whatever period you like, whether it's from the time they left Egypt into the desert or from the time Moses received the law into the end of the time of the kings. Very often it's until the kingdom split into Israel and Judah. You have this model of a Hebrew Republic where the model itself is something on which you can shape your society. So for example, Petrus Cuneus, who's a Dutch thinker, not very well known, but we just published his book called The Dutch Republic, work from 17th century Holland, where Cuneus explains the different political structures of the ancient Hebrew Republic, that he recommends the Dutch Republic to use some of these structures as they construct their own nation, their own laws, and their own understanding of themselves. Looking, for example, at a system of social justice as part of the Jewish contribution at this moment in history. How do we run our society that the rich give something of their land to the poor, and how do we distribute resources? So one is the idea of tithes, then we have the idea of the Sanhedrin as a model for how do we organize our judicial system, which represents for these thinkers a court system as a whole, or the idea that you shouldn't have a monarch, which was a huge question. Of course, in the Torah and in the Jewish tradition, there are all sorts of interpretations of should you have a king or should you not have a king. And various political thinkers at this time in early modernity were saying either you should have a king or you should not have a king based on taking different Jewish sources as their model. So it's not just a legalistic sources or a legal understanding of the world, it's also institutional. These type of sources and these type of texts open up new ways of dialogue between religious sources and the world in which we live. And they also show us, our sources have meant something in the past. What might they mean to us today as Jews, as citizens of the world, as people who, our origins are not so different from the origins of the Christian world or of the modern nation state. And we'd like to know how do we fit into this story.
2030 is a city that is growing fast. Tel Aviv was not built on the seashore, so people are not aware of that. They took from different architecture styles elements. There is one significant building, it's called the Gymnasia Herzliya, a symbol for the eclectic style. It was a very bourgeois city, the city of sophisticated shops. That was Tel Aviv in the 30s. To an extent, nothing had changed.
I'm creating a new image or a new concept. It's a need I have. It's an obsession. Language of icons are very powerful, immediate, strong, and aggressive.